this project is currently part of Interop during the bridging period, and it's aiming to bridge as well this divide between political theory and new political practice, especially practice in participatory and deliberative e-democracy tools. So I'm going to first kind of lay out this problem that the project is aiming to address, and then get into what this project is aiming to do about that problem, and then close with two examples of what we can accomplish and kind of what we can do for each side when we bridge this gap, and then Q&A and some information on how you can follow with this project. So first, on this theory and practice gap, the problem that this project is aiming to address, as I see it, there are a lot of practitioners in this space that are very interested in political theory, but don't have as much background as, one, they would like to, and two, maybe they could benefit from in doing their work on these various tools. So there's a lot of kind of common sense views of democracy and a lot of very radical ambitions in this space that I feel like are not adequately supported by theorists. But there's also, in the kind of common theories that I see a lot of people discussing in this space, the ways that people interpret the work that they're doing, there's very much a liberal and economic bias. And I mean liberal in the, not the left-wing American sense, but kind of in the classic liberal conception. And there's less familiarity with theories that are very applicable to and useful to interpreting and understanding these tools, especially deliberative democracy and especially participatory democracy. And kind of the result of this is, as I put it in some of my PhD applications, that practitioners end up kind of walking backwards into the future. So people are looking backwards at these old theories that were designed and imagined for a much earlier time, while kind of charting a path, walking backwards into a future of democratic practice. And then on the theorist side, there's a lot of inertia in political theory. Political theory is much, much, much older than political science as we understand it today. I've got this little fun Greek word here. Maybe I have too much text on these slides, but political theory really dates back to the very first academics with Plato's Academia in 380 BC or so, I think it was founded. And so there's a lot of old ideas in these debates around political theory concepts, and there has not really been a reckoning with the massive tech changes that have happened in recent decades. Kind of, from my perspective, mainstream democratic theory has not even really finished reckoning with the internet, let alone AI and a lot of the kind of Web 2 and Web 3 and other online technologies that have been developed since. And I think there's been, from the perspective of the possibilities of mass participation, there's been probably more change between now and 1980 than there was between 1980 and 380 BCE, when kind of academia got its start and our concepts of democracy kind of came into their own. And the familiarity that there is in academic spaces with practical work on e-democracy tools is mostly limited to a few very famous cases like v-Taiwan or Italy's Rousseau platform, both of which are now defunct and have been for years. Yet you'll still see political theorists kind of talking about the exciting stuff that's happening in Taiwan. And there is a lot of exciting stuff happening in Taiwan, and everything that came out of v-Taiwan is definitely not dead, but the platform itself has been inactive for a very long time. And then I also think there's really a very intense focus on democratic backsliding that is understandable, but without making democracy something that's worth defending, it's very difficult to defend. And so I think there needs to be much more of a forward-looking perspective. And these tools could be that, but because of these various problems, there's kind of a loss of traction on the present. And so we can't stop from sliding into the past, and we also can't get the traction that we would need to go into the future and to guide the development of this new and emerging practice. So the solution to this problem of a gap between theory and practice is the Theory and Practice project, aiming to bridge these two sides. So I'm with this project, it's mostly this kind of, these first stages are targeted at practitioners because Metagov is mostly a practitioner organization, but that's going to involving kind of exploring what we should be doing, not just what these tools are capable of, but what the vision of democracy that we should have as we're developing these tools is, and giving practitioners tools that they need to be thinking through these problems, and not just relying on academic political theorists, because I don't think that you need to be a professional political theorist to do political theory. So I think political theorists can do a lot to bring these concepts and these very, very relevant elements of democratic theory into practitioner spaces and make them more comprehensible and more applicable. And that's going to involve some other seminars. This one's kind of just introducing the project, but some other seminars maybe on specific topics later this month, early next month, and then kind of see where that goes depending on reception, but also some readings, resources, potentially research guides. People have raised the idea of reading groups that they might be interested in, and I'm very interested during the Q&A, or there will be a survey linked at the end if anybody has thoughts on other things that this project could be doing that would be useful in your spaces. And then on the theorist side, I think it means introducing political theorists and academics to what we already can do and learning from what's already being done, whether or not there's always a concrete or a fully thought out theoretical explanation behind it. New political practice is developing in the present, and there needs to be a lot more attention to that. And there also, I think, can be a lot of valuable inductive study of this new practice that can lead us towards a new theory. So I don't think that this is a one-way theorists coming in and teaching political practitioners what they should be doing, but there's also a lot of political practitioners who are already doing these things and have practical experience with them, helping theorists understand the values that are implicit in these methods, but also what these new forms of political practice allow us to think and imagine about democracy. So that's this new democratic theory. And then finally, I'm still kind of thinking this one through. We'll see what works, but I think part of this is going to be helping political practitioners frame their tools in ways that are, and their communication around their tools in ways that are more comprehensible for political theorists. A lot of people that I've worked with, they're not the most tech literate people in the world, I'll say. And so I think framing things in a way that is more comprehensible and the goals in a way that's more comprehensible to academics is going to be very valuable at attracting academic interest to these spaces. And then maybe some practical resources, kind of thinking through what that might be. I've been collecting, for one, podcasts from political practitioners and people in the democracy innovation space. So if you have any other links, that would be great, but it's going to be more than just a podcast list, hopefully. Oops. So now the first of two examples that I want to talk about for benefits that can kind of come from bridging this divide. This one is a problem for practitioners that we can benefit by bringing existing political theory into these spaces and into these conversations. So this is something that I think I've discussed with some of you on this call already in the interviews I've been doing as part of this project. But there's this question around, why should we value democracy? Why should we care about it? Why is it something that's worth having, let alone improving? And a very common argument in favor of democracy goes like, democracy delivers a lot of instrumental benefits to us. It has what in political theory is called epistemic benefits, meaning it helps us make good decisions, benefit from collective intelligence, benefit from diversity, either of viewpoints or of ways of thinking, or social levels of social standing. It helps kind of induce competition among competing parties or competing sort of factions in society or competing ideas in a way that's beneficial. And then secondly, democracy, this argument goes, grants legitimacy to political institutions. So it increases trust in society generally, but especially in governing institutions. It produces stability, it ensures social peace. But I think if we understand democracy primarily as delivering these sorts of instrumental benefits, then we have to ask, what if another system, a dictatorship or a monarchy or a technocracy or a kind of party government could do these things just as well or even better? And whether or not that's possible is another matter. But hypothetically, if we said here I've got this like dictatorship or rule by ChatGPT or something that I can prove to you is going to deliver equal or better epistemic benefits or equal or better legitimacy. Would we just say, okay, if they're the same, we can flip a coin on whether or not we're going to have democracy? It doesn't really matter. Or if they're even better, would we immediately abandon democracy, or would there be something holding us back? Is there something else that we're looking for from democracy besides just these instrumental benefits? And I suspect most people will have this intuitive attachment to democracy and this feeling that something would not really be right with that, even if hypothetically we buy into these benefits coming from a non-democratic system, there would still be something else to value in democracy. So I think this, for most people, is going to be an understanding of these intrinsic benefits of democracy. And so just worked on an essay with Liz about this, which maybe we can share soon. But I think these can be kind of categorized in two ways. One, empowerment that comes from democracy. So democracy is not just about being governed well, it's about governing ourselves. And there's something important when we are governing ourselves. And you can see I have Republican self-government again. That's not Republican in the American sense, but in the kind of classic sense. And there's this understanding in the Republican tradition and in the history of political theory that there's something intrinsically valuable. It's a form of freedom and human well-being that comes from making the rules ourselves. And even if a technocrat could come in and make really good rules for me, that's worse for me in some important way than if I'm together with my community making rules for myself in my own life and also my community and the shared social world that I live in. And then a second important element on this intrinsic side, which also, as we've discussed in this essay, kind of spills over into instrumental benefits as well, but is the development that comes from participation in democracy. And this is especially something that political theorists, especially Carol Payton very famously made this case, is valued in the participatory strand of democratic theory, that you realize your potential as a person and you flourish as a human being and you reach better self-understanding and you develop collective self-understanding, collective solidarity, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of identity through your participation in politics with others. And this is obviously the famous Zoon politikon from the ancient Greeks, this idea that humans are naturally political animals, naturally political beings, and that if we were just to go live as an all-powerful entity off in the forest on our own, never being infringed upon in any other way by other people, we maybe in our common liberal way of thinking of freedom today, we would say that person is totally free. But if we understand that we need to be integrated into political self-governing communities, we would say that person is really missing something essential in their life. And that's what we can achieve through this type of participatory democracy. And so, sorry, just to wrap that up, I got a little lost there, but just to wrap this up, I think this is a justification, an understanding of democracy that is intuitive to most of us, whether or not we're working on these sorts of new democratic practices, but is not really fully understood in public. And I think it's very important to understand why we are concerned with democracy so that we can understand, one, why we should remain committed to it and how we might be kind of going astray of our own values in certain forms of practice, like Liz's AI simulation that I'm sure she's talked to a lot of people here about, but we also talked about in that essay, but also understanding why we're trying to improve democracy and what it means to improve it and what kind of the goal that we're trying to move towards is. Then on the theorist side, a problem for theorists that I think is really being figured out right now in these practitioner spaces without theorists noticing this is a different understanding of what it means to make decisions. And so in especially liberal democratic theory, but kind of in mainstream political theory, and especially in kind of popular understandings of democracy, there's this idea that democracy is consent to government that is expressed by voting. And that could be, I'm consenting to the rule of politicians and elected representatives by authorizing them to be decision makers via elections. That's the way that most democracies, or what would be called democracies, work today. And then there's this idea of direct democracy. And this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. One of the reasons I don't use the phrase direct democracy very often is that direct democracy is so often just boiled down to we have a referendum about everything. But then there's a lot of really important questions there, like who made the referendum question? Who is deciding when there's going to be a referendum? Who does all the framing in public about what this referendum is about and what the considerations are on each side? And I think there's something very important. There's a very important difference between voting on a question that is posed to me by somebody else, already pre-framed and pre-set up, and they're the ones deciding to even ask the question in the first place, let alone what the question is going to be, versus contributing to making this decision and then voting on it, which I'm going to get to in a second. But then there's also this critique in feminist theory that I'm personally very interested in and kind of working on in my studies by some of these scholars, this idea that consent as an ethic is necessarily inegalitarian. And as soon as you're talking about consent, you're already accepting, you're already baking into your thinking this active-passive agent-object actor-consenter dichotomy, where the person who is consenting is understood to have a less full form of agency than the person who is proposing the thing that is being consented to. And so in feminist theory, there's this discussion of consent as kind of always being gendered in the way that we talk about it, and this assumption that men are active and women are kind of passive, and that we can take this same critique and apply it to political consent and understand that when we're talking about political consent and democracy as consent to government, we're talking about passive people accepting the rule of an active political elite that decides what are going to be the questions, what's going to be the framing, when are we going to decide on this or that. And then if you live in a so-called direct democracy, you get to authorize or not authorize those decisions. And if you live in actual democracy as they exist today, you are not even voting on that. You're just voting on who gets to make those decisions. So I think political theory lacks a sufficient understanding of what it means to make a decision. And I think this exact problem is being explored in really, really interesting ways that are very deserving of close attention and inductive study in these e-democracy practitioner spaces right now. So just a couple quick examples, and you can see I've got question marks after all of these because even I don't know kind of what the theory of decision-making that's operating in these different cases is, but I think it's worth studying in these e-democracy platforms like Decidim. You've got the ability to not just vote on the final decision, but to deliberate and shape the decision, and even to initiate. The fact that there's going to even be a decision at all comes from a person initiating this process on one of these platforms. And then on platforms like Polis, I think we have this sort of persuading and being persuaded in turn form of agency where you are actively contributing to making the decision, such that even if the final decision you still don't disagree with, it's different than it would have been had you not participated. And I don't think that political theory really has a good account of that type of agency right now, but I think it is being put into practice right now in tools like Polis. And so I think we can think through what that type of agency is and what type of agency we should be aiming for in democracy by paying attention to what's happening in these kinds of tools. And then the last one, this is the one that's maybe the most on the fence or the most kind of controversial, is this idea of AI summarized deliberations, where you take a bunch of people and you maybe split them out into digital Zoom rooms like Stanford's open deliberative online deliberation platform does, or maybe you put them in small rooms and then sort of have them talk around like one of those old conference call boxes, except it has some sort of AI agent in it that's summarizing what people are saying, and then it's sort of bringing all these contributions together and summarizing that in an output. And I think there's definitely a more robust form of agency going on there than if I'm just going to the voting booth and voting blue, red, orange, that's it. But is there as much of a full form of agency as these other tools? I don't know. But I think these are the sorts of things that practitioners are having to decide and having to make decisions on in their engineering choices about their tools and about their processes. And I think political theorists could benefit a lot from paying attention to what is being done there and joining those conversations and contributing their perspective as well to these debates. So that's the end of this little introduction. We've got this 5-minute survey QR code here for anybody that's interested and wants to kind of have some input on what this project might be able to do going forward, or just sort of share your perspective and where you're coming from. There's also this project page here that has a couple of links. So if you want just one thing to throw into your browser, grab this link and you will find the survey and a couple other things there. That will also be where the other seminars and reading lists and stuff, that's where that will start appearing. And then there's this new Theory Practice channel in Slack where there's not a lot of activity yet. I've got a couple things that I'm going to post soon, but we'll also be posting updates about the upcoming seminars and resources and other things in that channel. And then also just happy to have discussion with anybody who's interested in these topics there as well. So with that, I will close and yeah, open it up to any questions. Or I don't know if Liz, you want to bring us into the next section or anything, but that's it for my presentation.
Just to thank you, Joseph. That was a great presentation. I think a lot of food for thought, but also appropriately like bite-sized and helping step us through some of these really fundamental questions that I think we can feel like ethically and morally when you pose them like this, and then imagine how we're scaling those instincts and concepts up into our technology. And I think that was a really nice invitation for us to maybe, come together as a group and think about some of these base assumptions. Yeah, so thank you very much for that. Let's go to questions.
I have a question. I'm super curious, Joseph, to hear a little bit more about how you're thinking about rolling this program out on a practical level, just in the sense of like, I heard you say that you wanted to host some seminars, but like, do you imagine us like having these conversations in different deliberative tool environments and feeling like like having those experiences and discussing theoretical concepts? Is it like in a practical sense, a blend of theory plus practice, or is it like discussion format? Curious your thinking on that.
That's a really interesting question that I had totally not thought of at all until just this moment. And the idea of doing some of these discussions in some of these tools and in some of these spaces, that's very interesting. No, I had not thought of that. I'm definitely thinking about that now, and I'm going to think about that. But the plan was to do some seminars outside of the main Metagov seminar slot, but kind of specifically on these topics. I have a couple questions in that survey about what topics would you be most interested in attending seminars on, or what are you most interested in, or what do you feel like you have the poorest understanding of, things like that, that I'm going to kind of be collating those results. And one, I'm going to be publishing an anonymized version of the results just for people's interest, but also using that to inform the topics of those discussions. So probably the first one it's looking like is going to be on something like theories of democracy or theories of representation. That's something that a lot of people have expressed interest in. And that will probably be a sort of open discussion where there will be maybe a little bit of ahead of time reading, not like whole books or anything, but a little bit of kind of key excerpts from important sources, and then a discussion. And yeah, a couple of people have raised the ideas of reading groups that they would really like to do, things like that. But it's going to start with those two smaller seminars and then sort of see where it goes, see what would be beneficial to people from there.
Can I?
Cool. Yeah, I was just gonna say, I just like my ears perked up when you were talking about Stanford's like deliberative tool, and I'm like, I am curious what all these different communities that are thinking about this kind of, in like on their separate paths, but we're all like just like Metagov, but not, and what they're using and how they're thinking about these things and playing with these things. So yeah, that was kind of where that question came from, was like, what's Stanford's deliberative tool look like? Fancy Stanford. Anyways.
Val, we'll have to pull you closer into the deliberative tooling project, which is just chock full of now, I think, approaching 24 different deliberation methods and platforms where those methods are variously implemented. I think you'd have a good time over there. And there's a lot of work going on. There's so the core values work that Joseph was just referencing, he and I just released an essay, which leads into then how do we express the rights that participants have when they come in on these platforms. How do we get to a point where it's possible to pool our data together ethically and build a public AI that's capable of helping more of us deliberate? And then when we deliberate, what exact facilitation modules are we using? So there's a facilitation library project that has both that has members from some of the largest tech corporations on the world, as well as people who are in some way, political refugees from authoritarian states. That is a wild collaboration going over there. And then work proceeds on the name of the research area itself, the interoperability part. There are lots of people working on schemas and starting to connect with governmental use cases that are driving that. So that's just a little quick overview of the interoperable deliberative tooling program. Has a lot of work streams going on right now, and the people and those work streams are full of the people who are making these platforms that Val you've expressed interest in. So yeah, it's really fun to be at Metagov, which ends up being kind of the place where kind of the gathering place, or the watering hole a little bit of this field.
And that's the thing I'm interested in too. In Gravity DAO, one of the things that we're doing is creating a suite of tools that will do very similar kinds of things, not necessarily toward governance, because I always think of governance as like, do this because I said so. Like how do you actually figure out where you are within the consent model? So that's why I included Betty Martin's thing. So we're actually going to be creating a bunch of tooling around that stuff to be able to make decisions and stuff too. So I'm super interested in what you guys are doing and how you're going about doing it. So we're going to be hiring developers and everything. And so, yeah, how do we do it less in a governance mindset, but more of a co-creative or iterative mindset? So it's assumed that all of us are here together and we're all co-creating this thing, as opposed to creating some kind of governance framework, which then ossifies into something over time, and then we have to send lawyers in to fix laws that continue to be applicable 150 years after the fact. Do you know what I mean? So
I couldn't imagine what you mean, Regis. No, thank you for that. Yeah, the tool, the work in this research area has been very deep, which is actually kind of how Metagov works. Like Metagov is a place primarily aimed at the builders and researchers of these tools. And after they get some work done, we put out something like guidance, standards, best practices. That comes after the work actually happens to create those. So probably the biggest stress point of doing this work is, okay, people are here doing work in public, but that doesn't mean that there's consumable outputs yet. I think Joseph's project here, Joseph's practice, is a real addition, because he is going to be hosting these more open conversations that it is going to be possible to just drop into and, like re-examine some of our core assumptions, which is really a fantastically accessible addition to this project.
Yeah,
do we
I
have
love
any
it.
questions for Joseph? Thanks, Regis.
I have a question for him, in the sense that would you like to participate in creating a tool that accurately assesses consent?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think for me, kind of like I laid out, I think consent itself is a problematic concept, and consent is a sort of pre-constrained view of political agency or just agency in general, but political agency specifically. So I might maybe put out, maybe that'll be one of the kind of topics that I put out a list of accessible readings on. But I'm definitely interested in any conversations, any work that's happening around that. So if maybe you can drop like a link to the work that you guys are doing on that in that Slack channel that I posted, and I'll post the name of again in the chat. And yeah, I'm definitely interested in having more conversations about that.
And I see Johnny's hand up, but let me just say, just logistically, the way in to working with Joseph is do Joseph's survey. Maybe Joseph, you could drop that link. That's how you're meeting practitioners and setting up your intake interviews and things like that.
I'm almost done with it.
Johnny?
Thanks. This is not a clear question, but I just bouncing off a conversation I was in earlier today. Joseph, are you hearing anything in your interviews or in your research about, I'm seeing a distinction between there's theory and practice. There's a certain practice which is achieved through building tools. And then there's a whole like theory and practice around actually getting people to participate with those tools. I was speaking to some people working in a context today where there was like lots of barriers between this group does not want to be in the same conversation as this group. And are there digital tools that can make that better, or is that just a very, very human thing that you have to deal with no matter what amazing tool you have at your disposal?
Yeah, I mean, this is always going to be a tension, I think, in any human community, but I think this is honestly one of the arguments, as many critiques as I have of representative government. One of the arguments that people often have in favor of it is that it's very difficult to equalize people's participation when anybody can participate, and then you're kind of opening, you're kind of expanding the gap between like people who are really good at participating and maybe very talented speakers and very knowledgeable of the topics, and then people who maybe have strong opinions but are not very good at expressing them, or maybe don't really understand the issues as well, even though their interests are very relevant there. And so people will say that having these people just elect representatives that they trust and letting them kind of speak on their behalf can equalize the influence of these two people because they both get the same vote. And so if you condense all of their political agency down to this binary yes, no, red, blue, you're equalizing them in that way. And I think that kind of applies to these cases you're talking about as well, where if I have two groups that maybe for various reasons, it's very hard for them to participate together in the same space, maybe there's space for electoral mechanisms there, or maybe instead there's space for kind of facilitated mini publics or various forms of statistical representation. But at the end of the day, if one group is feeling like they're kind of insulted by a process, or they just can't tolerate participating in the same space as another group, I think that's kind of a pre-political, or maybe not pre-political, but that's an inevitable problem that's going to exist everywhere that I think just comes down to facilitation skills and community building, I guess. Sorry, that's not a clear answer, but it's a very, very good and very difficult question.
Yeah, question on this. I mean, the right to say no, like the refusal to participate, is a very important tool that communities have to resist illegitimate processes. And I personally would not want us advocating, along the way to total participation. I would not want to be steamrolling individual and communities' right to non-participation, and which they're choosing not to participate because they do not want to be captured. So yeah, I just wanted to put that in there. I think we talk a lot about deliberative tooling, and we know we want to increase participation and the power of that. But there's some hundreds or a few thousands of people making deliberative tools, and we're going to touch tens and hundreds of millions of participants. We need to be thinking about their rights We do
Right.
have Stack. I think we have Simone and then Ian.
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph, for your interesting presentation. As we talked a bit about, I do something very similar to you, and eager to collaborate, of course. So what comes to my mind in terms of practice, very practice thing that I'm approaching right now is like to approach the activists that convene in physical, in particular, in different parts of the world, in maybe social centers, and the maybe in a clubs, maybe this the more cybernetic part of these social centers that is more ready to have these tools. But what I think in the sense of participation that is in these social centers and like activist groups, occupations, and this kind of any kind of organizations, formal and informal, but in particularly informal, that have a lot of energy, but is not so well organized sometimes, and has the very much potential that could be catalyzed by these tools, and in which these practices in different parts of the world could be enhanced in the same moment and gathered in some platforms such Metagov or etc. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely think that's very interesting. And one of the things, some of the projects that I've worked on, I'm a member of the NDP in Canada, which is our kind of social democratic party. And some of the big projects that I've done have been using these tools. Like we used Polis at our national convention in October of 2023, and then for a couple other kind of public engagement projects. And I think that these tools can sort of democratize a party as well. They don't always have to start right away at the national level and be doing like millions and millions and millions of people deliberating on one specific topic. But if you can democratize a party, like obviously as the 5-Star movement tried to do with sort of middling level of success in Italy, but also there's Podemos has tried similar things. I think some of the pirate parties in Northern Europe have tried this. The Green Party here in Canada has tried this. I think there's ways to implement these tools that don't just start with going to national governments and saying, hey, use this tool tomorrow. You can start low and work your way up, and democratizing the organizations that interface with government is a way of democratizing government to the extent that those groups are influencing them. So that's a very clear linkage in terms of political parties, but also one of the other projects that we ran was with a lot of civil society organizations. And I was working with like the Farmers Union in Ontario on one of these Polis projects, and a couple other experts on some other projects. And they're really, really excited about these tools. And I think that activists and organizers and I'll call them old politics people, people involved in old politics, that is, not old people involved in politics, though they can be both, they really get it as soon as they see these tools. And as long as they're explained in a way that makes sense in their world, they immediately see the promise here. And so I do think there's a lot of potential to be working with those kinds of groups to get adoption of these tools and to sort of build this new practice. Maybe I can throw it to Ian.
Hey, really, really interesting talk. So thank you. I have a couple of somewhat poorly formed questions, but one, I was curious, particularly, I think in the Canadian context, right, there's a different notion of Indigenous and First Nations self-governance and self-management, and a different legacy of settler colonialism. And so I'm kind of curious how you reconcile that with some of the theories and some of the, particularly I think like the narratives about democracy that do kind of reflect a very Eurocentric notion, right, or this kind of assumption that like democracy comes from ancient Greece and then kind of follows the Western canon. But there are all kinds of community self-management practices and forms across history, but also that indigenous and non-Western ones often account for the kind of decision-making or consideration of things beyond humans, right? So like the more than human nature, the natural world, and, you know, in some more sort of Western theories, like Bruno Latour developed the idea, right, of like the parliament of things and the sort of more than human governance systems. So I'm curious what you think about that, but then also, you know, my background is that I'm a social worker. So I've worked a lot with communities that are, I mean, for instance, right now, often just being kind of dehumanized, right, and sort of denied the very idea of rights under current more authoritarian states, either because of backsliding on not just democratic practices, but like government policies or cultural norms of inclusion and the expansion of a sort of universal subjectivity, right, or a humanism. But there's always that kind of dark side of leaving people out in these institutions and processes, and kind of denying them the same equality. And often people are in positions where they don't have the resources, you know, be that time or social capital or political capital, to be able to participate and kind of acculturate themselves into these tools. And that could even be as something as simple as like not familiarity with technical tools or access to the internet in the same way. So I'm just kind of curious how you think about these in relation to your project and theorizing, but also practice.
Yeah, these are, I know I keep saying this to everybody's question, but these are very good questions. And I think I'll kind of really quickly on the non-human democracy thing. I know this is definitely a thing that gets discussed a lot. And if for anyone who's interested in this topic of like expanding democratic rights beyond human beings that hasn't already, I would very, very highly recommend reading Hartmut Rosa's. I'll put the name in chat, but he's a philosopher. I think he's Dutch, but or some one of those Western European countries, and he has some really interesting work on like resonance and how we interface with non-human kind of elements in the world. I'm skeptical that it is meaningful to discuss democracy beyond the bounds of human beings. That's not to say that non-human elements of the environment are not worth caring about. That's obviously on its face not true, as we can see with climate change. But also, I think you can definitely say that we owe a certain level of respect, of dignity, of rights to non-human organisms and beings without necessarily expanding democratic participation to those groups, because then I think you really run into a lot of problems. And what does it mean for like a mycelium to participate in governing society? You know, if we're really trying to equalize agency, I think it is kind of an unsolvable problem. So that aside, but it's a very interesting question, and mine is only one view of many that you could have on that. In terms of indigenous traditions of government, definitely agree that there's a lot to draw on there. And I think political theory, in pop conversations, maybe not, but I think political theory is much better now than it was in the past at recognizing the non-Western elements or non-Western traditions that are, even when they haven't used the word democracy, basically doing the same thing. I kind of have an argument that I think human beings are a naturally democratic species, and I think there's some kind of emerging cognitive science work that supports that I won't get into in the last few minutes we have. But I think on one side, I think we can be critical of certain forms of non and anti-democratic indigenous government while also recognizing the really interesting contributions. Like, for example, it sounded like you were in Canada, but for anybody else who doesn't know, our northern territories, especially Nunavut, have these traditions of nonpartisan government that are currently in their formal institutions where they have like a round table style of government with consent-based or consensus-based decision-making, and they have no political parties. And I think the leadership chair even rotates regularly during the meetings and stuff. A very, very interesting form of governance that I think deserves a lot more study, but I think is probably better known. My guess would be that if I was to go around and do a survey of political theorists in Canada, 10 times more of them would be able to describe something about Nunavut's form of government than even know the name Decidim or Polis or the 5-star movement's Rousseau thing. So I think there's more attention on that, even though there could be even more, there's more attention on that than there is on these tools. And then lastly, on the comments that you had about inviting other people to participate, I definitely think that is one of the huge benefits of these tools. And I will tell the story some other time, maybe, because I see we're running low on time, but from some of my experiences implementing these tools, it has like been extremely inspiring how much power these bring to people who would not be able to participate in using traditional methods of political participation, and the way that it equalizes their power in these organizations is one of the best benefits that they have, I think. But yeah, maybe I'll throw it to Steve really quick. Sorry about my long answer there.
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering how curious you are about economic systems within this format. In other words, for example, is it a form of governance that you want to discuss to, say, have an externalities market, and how that would operate in order to, get things properly priced in a marketplace? Like, would that fit into your framework?
I'll try to answer that, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding the question. Are you asking if market forms of pricing things that kind of try to account for externalities are relevant to this approach to politics?
Right, exactly.
I think that that's interesting. As I sort of hinted at a little bit in my slides, I'm very skeptical of these economic forms of politics, and I got to write a nice little article about this that maybe I'll drop in the chat really quick. But
all right, I'll tear that apart.
Great.
Drop it
yeah,
in the
look
chat.
forward to
I couldn't disagree with you more.
Drop
All
it
right.
in the chat. There you go. But yeah, I do think that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. I'm just skeptical that that form of market balancing of interests is equivalent to meaningful political participation.
I would agree it's not equivalent, but it, can be good. And I just wondering if it's in your framework or not, but okay.
I definitely think that it is worth considering and worth bringing.
But it's mostly outside of your framework. Okay, great. Thanks.
For me, yeah.
Great. Joseph, I'm wondering if you could put up your last slide that has the Slack channels that people can find you in, and the link to the survey again, and anything else you might want to say to wrap us up.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. This was really great and really amazing thoughts. I was kind of taking a lot of notes here, so even though I didn't get to address everything, I definitely am happy to continue these discussions in this Slack channel that is linked here. And the survey, anybody that wants to, I'm more than happy to get more contributions on that. It's really been helpful for me in understanding where people are at, what people are interested in. And you can follow this webpage for everything to do with this project will be there. So if you want one thing to follow, it should be that. But also I will be trying to post as many updates in the Slack as possible. And there will probably be some kind of interim discussions before the first Theory and Practice seminars, which are probably going to be in late April, early May. I'm kind of looking at 2 of them right now, and then we'll sort of see where we go from there if that format's working for people. But yeah, otherwise, happy to continue these discussions with people, and really looking forward to where this project takes us and what people can learn from each other here and what I can learn from all of you. So thanks again, and hope to speak to you guys soon.
Great. Thanks, Joseph. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. If we want to unmute and give Joseph a round of applause, as we always do, let's do it before we all head on with our days. So 3, 2, 1, go. Cool. Yay, thank you.
Sorry to always stop late.
Yeah, thanks for the
Bye,
great
everyone.
work. Appreciate it.
Everyone.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.